Imagine a world where all information is controlled. History's been rewritten in favor of an all-controlling party. Language has been remade to eliminate subversive concepts. Your every action is monitored and a looming threat hangs over you as a reminder of what happens if you step out of line. Now, this is part of the image that George Orwell painted in his book 1984, but all of these factors are actually in place in the world that we know today in one form or another. We have politically correct language. Certain words are off limits. Various concepts forbidden. Private businesses and big data, they've already largely eliminated privacy in the digital world where, much of modern life takes place. And already, we see sweeping pushes for mass censorship, an expansion of basically all these controls. We're now seeing this come to the forefront in a new battle unfolding between the United States and governments throughout Europe. And on one side, European leaders are saying, look, they need to fight against harmful online content, abusive big tech business practices. On the other side, the United States is arguing this isn't really about safety. They say instead, it's about global political control through the control of information. And whichever side wins as this battle unfolds, this could determine the future of not just the digital world, but of modern life overall. Now, something interesting just happened. Now, normally, when we think of asylum seekers, we tend to think of refugees fleeing war, famine, genocide. We tend to not think of developed countries. But now we could actually see people seeking asylum in the United States coming from the United Kingdom, because something else is under threat. Their freedom of speech and the natural right to free thought. This is now deemed a human rights issue by the US government. And it actually goes beyond even just that. The United States is now treating officials in Europe like tyrants restricting freedom of speech. Secretary of State Marco Rubio announced that British and EU officials who silence free speech are now barred from entering the United States. Now, just like you'd see with any other human rights initiative, the Trump administration is also funding a free speech initiative in Europe. Now, why does this matter so much? Because, well, things still might go either way. Europe is pushing back, and they're forming a new coalition to go after what they deem as harmful online content and online speech, not just in Europe, but globally. And not only that, they also want to lock down platforms even in the United States and make them follow their rules. As part of this initiative, they even came out with an announcement against America's open rules on speech, declaring that under their rules, quote, "We are the free world now." Now, part of this is being framed as an effort to protect kids, fighting against things like pornography, addictive algorithms, hateful content. And this includes a full social media ban for kids being rolled out in many countries. This includes the United Kingdom, France, Poland, the Netherlands, a long list of others. But they're also not set on just banning harmful content for kids. There were talks to, quote, kill Musk's Twitter, referring to X, which is run by Elon Musk. And that was also tied in with a Soros-funded British working group that was accused of censoring notably conservative news websites. Now, France even raided the local offices of X, and they say they're investigating harmful content, including alleged child sex abuse material, deep fakes, Holocaust denial content, and they say fraudulent data extraction. Elon Musk says the raids are politically motivated. And after the raid, well, the UK has also opened similar investigations. Going back a little further, though, in 2024, British authorities were threatening to even extradite and jail American citizens for making posts on the internet that they say influenced riots in the UK. And the incident came amid anti-migrant riots. This was after a second-generation Rwandan stabbed 3 children to death and injured several others at a Taylor Swift-themed dance class. Now, since then, there's even been discussions warning that Americans could be arrested for violating hate speech laws in other countries if they cross the border into a country where these laws exist. But some of the censorship and information monitoring programs already in place, they also took place with cooperation right here in the United States. Among the many operations along these lines was actually one in 2024. This was an agreement between the Biden administration State Department and the government of Spain, and they said it was aimed to combat alleged disinformation. Now, the Trump administration coming in, they've since gotten rid of not just that, but all joint efforts with other countries to combat what they call alleged harmful information. Now, a big concern, though, is where this could all lead. The nightmare situation, the one everyone wants to avoid, is what we're already seeing taking place in China. An all-encompassing surveillance state paired with state-run industries and a big digital currency that can lock anybody out of making payments. And this ties with what they call the social credit system. Basically, think a social credit score, but instead of being like a financial history, it's based on your citizenship rating. Are you a good citizen or a bad citizen? If you believe in democracy, in China, you lose points. If you practice a religion not under state control, you lose points. If you follow the regime and its narratives, well, you get better access to services. And a big part of this is to encourage a system of self-censorship. Now, in the United States, we don't have anything like that just yet, but the framework is actually already there. Already as we speak, businesses, they collect similar amounts of data through the surveillance state. Public-private partnerships allow the sharing of this data with law enforcement as we speak, and cancel culture through legacy news outlets and activist organizations, they already work as similar pressure for self-censorship. Step out of line, you could have your reputation destroyed by media attacks. But in other countries, including in Europe, there's something of a gray area. Wrong opinions and controversial speech could actually land you in jail. For the European Union, a key part of this is through the Digital Services Act, the DSA. Now, this went into effect in 2022, and it built a system to go after digital services and people who use them. And part of this is meant to stop things they say, like, again, harmful content for kids. But another part has been punishing social networks for not censoring their users or to punish people for content they even post on the internet. This has created a kind of global Judge Dredd scenario for European officials. They get to act as the judges, the investigators, and the prosecutors in these cases. Another key part of this is about politics and competition, though. It has not been a secret that the heavy fines, they tend to unevenly target American tech companies. And part of that isn't really about content moderation at all. It's about leveling the field of competition between American tech companies and European tech companies. They're attacking their competitors and giving themselves an advantage. The Information Technology and Innovation Foundation wrote that European firms, which typically have smaller numbers of monthly users, largely fall outside the DSA's enforcement. And it says, while large U.S. companies must contend with these rules. So rules for thee, but not for me. And it says that by exempting smaller platforms and imposing disproportionate obligations on foreign firms, the DSA functions as a non-tariff regulatory attack in the internet regulation landscape, and it says it contributes to a two-tier digital ecosystem that disadvantages non-European firms. They're effectively undermining their competitors to give themselves an advantage. Now, European leaders call this a type of global legal compliance. American leaders, particularly with the Trump administration, they frame these fines as being the same thing as tariffs. There are signals, though, that censorship policies like this do in fact tie in with tech competition. While European regulators go after social network X, for example, some are also pushing for the launch of a European alternative called W, and the name they have is supposed to stand for we. But the shape of the W is also supposed to have dual V's, which stand for values and verified. Now, in Russia, where the Telegram messaging app is facing pressure for being used for what they say criminal and terrorist purposes, the government there is pushing for a domestic rival app to replace it as well. In Germany, the government recently hit the Gab social network with a fine of over $37,000 because they say it violated Germany's speech laws. The problem, though, well, Gab is an American company with no presence in Germany, and Gab is actually refusing to pay the fine, by the way. But this push is extending even further beyond just control and moderation. It's actually reaching into the bones of free speech overall. Some of this includes a brand new push globally to completely end online anonymity. No more privacy. And this includes even going after the ability to lock content using encryption. No more security. This isn't just limited to giving authorities a backdoor into locked content. They even want access to the metadata behind it, the ability to see basically everything at the code level. Now, other programs include plans to have all chats scanned for government censors. In other words, nothing you type to your friends or family or whoever else gets done without it being up for enforcement and punishment. They see everything you write. Under the banner of a global push for child safety, content is now being regulated everywhere, not even just in one country or another. It doesn't matter which country it is. Just recently, the popular online chat platform Discord, they even rolled out a policy where every single user is locked into a limited access safe for teen accounts unless they upload a European-style age verification, which means you either scan your face or submit your official ID. Now, while comparing this to the nightmare situation in China is still pretty far out, the concerns it could create a type of New World gulag is not that far from the truth. No need for prisons in Siberia. You just get denied from the financial institutions that you need to, rent an apartment or find a job. We even saw this in Canada, by the way, in 2022. That was when truckers were protesting the COVID lockdowns. What happened? Well, in Canada, banks started freezing the accounts of people accused of being linked to the protests. In the United States, this is even happening. President Donald Trump even filed a lawsuit against JP Morgan Chase and its CEO for $5 billion. And he's accusing them of debanking him on political grounds just after the 2021 protests and riots at the Capitol building in Washington. Now, of course, this isn't to say there are not real problems with, dangerous content on the internet. There are adult sites pretty easily accessible to kids. And the lone wolf terrorists who recruit online. More recently, the FBI has been working to arrest members of a group called the 764 group that's been grooming teenagers and blackmailing them and even self-harm and other forms of abuse. There are some bad things on the internet. Over the last decade, faith in traditional media, though, has been on rocky ground, from false stories like the Trump-Russia hoax to politicized hit pieces to the whole narrative on the lying media. And then COVID happened. We had the declaration by the World Health Organization of a quote-unquote infodemic, an information pandemic, meaning not necessarily problems of false information, but too much information. They wanted to regulate all of it. There was the 100% safe and effective narrative, the controversies on alternative treatments like ivermectin, and just an overall lack of trust that resulted in what we're told. And then, we started learning about censorship through government pressure and public-private partnerships. Basically, in the United States, government cannot restrict free speech under the Constitution, but private businesses can. So the question is it still government censorship if a business gets pressured to censor by the government? Well, look, in 2015, Meta CEO Mark Zuckerberg said he felt pressured to censor Americans over COVID content during the Biden administration, and he said he regrets folding to that pressure because he says that happened to him.
Zuckerberg said he would push back if it were to happen again. He said he regrets the decisions made in 2021 to remove certain content, including humor and satire from Facebook, Instagram, as well as WhatsApp. The White House defended its approach in a statement saying, quote, when confronted with a deadly pandemic, this administration encouraged responsible actions to protect public health and safety.
Then there's the issue of fact checkers. But the problem is, who decides what's true and what's false? Who establishes what the single approved narrative should be? Now, some regard fact checkers as a necessity to fight against misinformation. Others, like ex-owner Elon Musk, say that fact checkers themselves have ironically been, quote, some of the biggest liars. But the real problem is that on one side, you could be argued that social media is very unhealthy for kids, and there actually is a lot of bad content on the internet. Platforms use deceptive products and addictive algorithms. There's the undeniable undercurrent that part of this is about crushing free speech, and That also ties in with interference in politics and the elections. And you could also argue a lot of this has to do with just social justice censorship, things deemed too offensive. But the problem is, many of the issues that fall under the category of hate speech also happen to be key parts of policy issues. In Europe, for example, the rising populist and conservative political parties, they're actually heavily focused on issues like mass migration, transgenderism, traditionalism, these things. So what happens if you censor the topics that represent their key political talking points? Well, it means you basically censor the elections. If you ask Congress right here in the United States, they say that this constitutes election interference. And that's actually now the story coming out. The U.S. House Judiciary Committee, they came out with a recent report that says the European Commission, that's the executive branch of the European Union, has interfered with 8 different elections in Europe in recent years. That includes the French elections, the Ireland elections, the Netherlands elections, a lot of others. It notes the Commission did this by forming agendas right before the election cycles. And what they did, they effectively criminalized the political platforms of rising candidates. The report even says this, quote, "The European Commission regularly pressured platforms ahead of EU member state national elections in order to disadvantage conservative or populist political parties." Meaning, this was done to basically use the narrative of censorship or dangerous content to achieve a political goal, to crush their opposition. And this could include things like a case in 2022 where a lesbian filmmaker and actress in Norway was told she was under criminal investigation and faced 3 years in prison for saying men cannot be lesbians. But policies like this are not even limited to the European Union. This is also tied in with the United Nations and UNESCO in particular. Go back to 2023, they began demanding global guidelines on internet speech, rules for the world. The agency's director noted that already, at least 55 countries are already working on censorship policies like this. And they say it's framed as going against hate speech, misogyny, suppression of free speech, they say, doxing, and quote-unquote conspiracy theories. But on the other side, the United States is doubling down on free speech as being protected under the American Constitution and the American idea globally, by the way. This is resulting in the tariffs and restrictions we're now seeing against European countries and regulators. And the basic idea ties into something a lot larger: a conspiracy against rights, policies or actions here or in other parts of the world that act to restrict the constitutional rights of Americans. And a big problem is that, well, the internet's global, so how do you regulate global business? Tech companies and online services are grappling with the complex laws of every country they're in. But what happens when they need to censor or abide by rules that then apply to everybody, even their users, regardless of where they live? Americans have to follow European law. Europeans maybe even have to follow Chinese law. Censorship policies like this already go beyond just Europe. And if this continues, well, it's very possible that freedom globally could be determined by the lowest common denominator. The strictest laws anywhere in the world will set the global standard. Yet, while the idea that some speech can be dangerous, and speech can sometimes be intentionally false, which both are true in some cases, this ties into a deeper principle of the American idea: freedom of belief, freedom of speech, the freedom of expression. The idea of freedom of speech ties into one of the bedrocks of the American idea itself, free market principles. And in this case, the marketplace of ideas. In other words, what works succeeds, what does not work fails. When it comes to speech, open debate lets us challenge concepts. We can expose what doesn't hold up, and through that debate also hopefully keep what can withstand scrutiny. It's how we arrive at truth. And this marketplace of ideas works as a kind of platform. It reveals truth, lies, and everything in between. If you restrict that, how do you determine what is true and what is not?